That's the entire purpose of this.
Yeah, it goes both ways. Last week was our first one and it was a lot of fun. You know, we got some good interaction. All right, YouTube is now live. And I probably have, I'm just realizing I have food in my teeth.
No, you're good, man.
After lunch webinars, nothing like them. I just have to drop this on join us live.
I think you need just like a production assistant.
Yeah, I'll ping with too as well. But yeah, I'm just posting right now and then we'll be good. We can get it kicked off. Everyone's late always anyway, right? So
I'm always annoyingly early to everything.
Well, most people are annoyingly late.
I once showed up to an interview like 2 hours early and just had to sit in my car. Get crazy anxious, and then I just have to get there really soon. I was like a half an hour early for dinner yesterday. It was great. Always bring a book somewhere.
All right, everyone on, we're just about to kick off. So give me 10, 15 more seconds. And we will be good.
And go bring friends.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah, tag all your friends on LinkedIn.
Hey, Amanda, this is my pirate hat. It doesn't really fit with this.
Oh, I love it.
Wow, that's fashionable.
It goes really well with your shirt also.
It does. This is my piracy presentation shirt.
Piracy?
Yeah.
When you say that, it just makes me think of like Kazoo or Napster, right?
I have my Marine Mom shirt on today.
Nice.
Ooh.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
How did that, is that thing done you talked about?
No, it's 54 hours long and he's right in the middle of it right now.
Cool. All right, I'm gonna share my screen. Thanks for everybody's patience. Oh wait, that's not the right screen. Advanced sharing options. All right, cool. Hey, guess what? I think I did it.
Look at that.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Oh, I don't want to share. I want to present.
There we go.
I'm still learning how to use PowerPoint.
Perfect.
Hey, thanks everybody for joining. It's 1:03. Hopefully, you know, if you're East Coast or Central or somewhere in between, you're getting a good meal in, whether it's lunch or breakfast or brunch. Yeah, today we're going to be talking about balance between compliance and security. And it's exciting to have Jamie Tomasello join us. Thank you, Jamie. Jamie was former head of trust and compliance at Duo Security and has a pretty extensive background in these areas. So I don't know if you want to comment any more on that.
Sure. So I have been in the internet security, trust and safety compliance space for the past 20 years. Actually, it's over 20 years now. I've worked for internet service providers, web mail security companies. I've worked for a law firm investigating cyber criminals on behalf of large ISPs. And so I've seen all different sides of this space, worked for vendors as well as been the customer of security vendors. So I hope to bring some perspectives that clear up some of the confusion around security and compliance.
Sweet. Thank you for joining. It's fun to have you on and kind of get back together. And hey, the other thing I think is interesting, it's like you kind of, I think, taking off most of the summer. What's that been like?
So that's been great. Yeah, I went on sabbatical, something called Liberty Leave, that Donica Snelson coined the phrase, but it's essentially, you know, where you take the time off from work to do the things that bring you, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so the original plan was to pursue traveling. That didn't quite happen, but instead, one of the things that I had been putting on the back burner has been going back to school and completing my degree. So I've been working on that. And the other thing was really just spending the time nurturing my connections with folks. Sometimes you get really deep into your work and you don't spend a lot of times really nurturing those connections with people. So that's what I've been doing this summer.
Sweet. Sounds like fun. I'm jealous. I'm sure Amanda is too.
Very.
And we have Amanda Berlin, Senior Incident Detection Engineer at Blumira. And does all sorts of things, both at work as well as a part of Mental Health Hackers. So yeah, it'd be great to hear a little bit about yourself before we hop into
cool.
discussion on compliance. Oh, always.
Let's see here. Yeah, so I work for Blumira. I love logs and creating detections. As far as my background on compliance stuff, I used to work for a hospital and help them come up with a couple different ideas on how to implement PCI correctly to become compliant. And then of course, working at a hospital, you always have to deal with HIPAA. And then just being on both sides of, IT and security and everything, have always had to deal with, whether it be filling out compliance forms or trying to help people meet it or having to work with security vendors. Yeah, I've been on all sides of it, I guess.
Sweet. And then real quick, I shut off the screen share, but I'm Patrick Garrity, kind of facilitating discussion here, VP of Operations at Blumira. And previously got to work with Jamie at Duo over many, many years. So, and at Duo, as well as Blumira, right, commonly used tool as it relates to, prevention, detection, and security aligned with compliance controls. So I've always had the fun time of mapping products to these extensive lists of
almost all
basically.
compliance need logs.
Yeah. So no, very, very true. I think it's interesting. Like on that note, you said every compliance needs logs. There's still a lot of customers that don't centralize logs, right? So we can talk a little bit about that. But before I kick it off, we're gonna start with a poll. And yeah, this one's not, the second poll is a lot more fun, I'd say. But this one's more or less, what compliance frameworks are you required to meet or most interested in? So I'll launch that poll. And as that's going, we can kind of kick off and start talking about this balance between security and compliance. And I think Jamie, you kind of coined this with some of the videos you collaborated with us on, which is like a balance of security and compliance. I think a lot of customers struggle with like, hey, which one do I prioritize? But yeah, curious to hear from you, like what does that balance, getting that balance really mean and look like?
Hey, Patrick, just for those who are taking the poll, when you're saying 871 there, you mean 171?
Oh gosh, sorry. Yep. Yeah, 171. Okay. Good call. I'm not as good as paying attention to detail.
It's
a new compliance.
Yeah, it's new.
We just wrote it yesterday.
It's more basic. It's not the 100 level. It's like the entry level.
All we did was just take out all the extra words.
I mean, if only, unless, it's about key manager, key establishment. So,
Right.
Cool. I'll let the poll go for a little bit, but yeah, just curious, like, it'd be cool to hear from you a little bit on this concept of balancing those two things, which is also the topic of the webinar, right?
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and go first, essentially lay the groundwork. What is compliance? For me, I didn't start in compliance. I started in technical support and then did abuse desk and then did general security, policy work, trust and safety, and then came to compliance in a roundabout way. I joke that I went into compliance because I think the frameworks resonated with me as a pirate, like PCI and GDPR. But I mean, that's not really why. I mean, for me, compliance, a lot of people think that compliance is only about adhering to a set of best practices, rules, framework requirements, contractual obligations, regulations, and legislation. And a lot of times that traditional capital C compliance lives in silos like finance or legal. And it's really separated from IT, security, and engineering. And that causes a lot of problems because we're not thinking about holistic compliance. And what does that really mean? You get inflexible policies that are written to address the requirements of compliance when it's separated from considering the practical security postures and the technical implementation, and ultimately the impact to the business employees and customers. So for me, compliance is more than just those things. Compliance is, how do we address security in a more holistic way versus just individual siloed teams doing individual siloed requirements.
And I think you can use them a lot of times to do it methodically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What do you, in one of the, I think one of the things you mentioned there on the compliance side is more or less, well, I think one thing to highlight here is like, if we look 5 or 8 years back, compliance didn't apply to all industries, right? It applied to things like PCI, HIPAA.
Still doesn't.
Yeah, and it still doesn't, but I think it's getting to a point where like almost every industry at this point is starting to see some level of compliance, whether it's PCI, HIPAA, all these different things, right? So
I know people will hate me for this, but I do think it's a good thing.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Like so many people do not like compliance because they've seen the bad side of it, right? You have an auditor come in and they're making me do things I don't want to do, and they are, you know, who's Nick?
They view compliance as a blocker, right? Compliance prevents me from doing my job, when it really shouldn't be viewed that way, right? Compliance, well, when done well, should be a business enabler, whether it is a way to show how your product helps meet the compliance needs for customers, it's a go-to-market enabler, or within your organization, it really helps address weaknesses that you have in your organization. And sometimes, you know, I'll hear ultimately folks are like, hey, I want to get a SOC 2. And I'm like, okay, great. You want to get a SOC 2, which type 1, type 2, what's your driver? Essentially going back to, well, what problem are you trying to solve? Why are we even talking about the words, you know, PCI DSS, SOC 2, FedRAMP, ISO 27000, a whole lot, like 1, 2, 18, lots of different ones. Yeah. And a lot of times the response that I hear back from organizations, specifically, I work with a lot of SaaS companies. So they say it's a customer requirement, a customer contractual obligation, because those customers utilize that third-party validation to help gauge whether the company that they're working with is trustworthy. Are you doing the right things? And are you doing them consistently? Do you practice what you preach? And there's not a lot of ways to show that outside of here's a certification that says that. Now, just because you have a certification, just because you're compliant with a framework, doesn't mean that you're secure. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we see, is that either you're taking compliance from a check the box mentality and you're not holistically addressing problems and looking at, hey, what are the security fundamentals within my organization that we need to meet? And do we have a cultural norm where we think about security first? It's not something separate.
Yeah, and I think one observation you said there, and I'm seeing this more than ever, and we didn't see this a year ago or a year and a half ago, is actually the companies that are doing business with other companies are actually making it a requirement that they have certain controls in place tied to the compliance that they have. And I think that's an interesting change that on the sales front, right, we've seen from a requirements perspective, is people coming saying like, hey, this large automotive company is now requiring me to actually follow a compliance framework to even fulfill their contract requirements, which is really, really interesting. So, hey, one thing on this note, right there, I think there's a lot of common myths associated with compliance, right? Like curious to get your take on like, what are some of the most common myths? And I think some of them you alluded to a little bit, which is, you know, around compliance makes you secure, but yeah, curious to get your take on you know, some of the common myths that are associated with compliance and challenges.
Sure. I think some of them, from my experience, some of the myths that I've run into within organizations are obviously, if we're secure, then we must be compliant. And if we're compliant, we must be secure. And it doesn't necessarily work that way. I'll let Amanda talk to the if we're secure, we must be compliant part. But if we're compliant, then we must be secure you know, I've seen it time and time again, and we've seen it in the news as well, where organizations have passed SOC 2, they have their ISO, they have all these different things where they are tested on their people, process, and technology. And ultimately, they still experience a breach. They still experience unauthorized access. There's still something that's going wrong. And I think that's because they are taking it from a check the box mentality. They aren't thinking about how do these individual controls, what's the spirit of the control? What's the spirit of the requirement, and how do they work together versus saying, you know what, I'm going to leave it to that other team to solve that particular requirement problem. And then all of a sudden that team doesn't implement it, or that control fails, or they implement a mitigating alternative or compensating control that doesn't mesh with the rest of it. And then all of a sudden you see cascading failures. And that's when we see really big situations occur. Amanda, do you want to talk to if we're secure, then we must be compliant?
Yeah, because I mean, I've seen it a couple times where I guess it depends on a few things, right? I've had people be PCI DSS compliant, but the person that came in and audited everything did not have a security background.
Yeah.
Right. So same thing with HIPAA or whatever. They come in, they know that they have the certain amount of things to do. They've done audits in a bunch of other places, and they don't realize the different impacts of how things are configured, and they may not be able to get to that point unless you have a team that you can work with, right? They're there to help you and like work back and forth. But if the company doesn't really know anything about security and neither does the auditor, that's kind of just gonna be a combination for failure. And I've also seen where there's very weird compliance things sometimes that you have to have done. I know we talked earlier about login banners being a kind of a weird example, because as far as security is concerned, like there's a bunch of different ways that you can address that. And, some people think there shouldn't be any login banners because that's just giving the potential attacker more information and saying yes, you are on the right system. So yeah, there's definitely the opposite can happen.
Well, I think oh, sorry, go ahead, Jamie.
It's okay. To Amanda's point about auditors, it's really awesome. Quite often that I've run into auditors who may be familiar with one type of technology. I've run into auditors who are like, well, you don't have Active Directory in place, so thusly you're going to fail any framework that says you must have Active Directory. There are frameworks that are more prescriptive than others, right? PSI or PCI DSS is more prescriptive than SOC 2, but it's really important.
That's good to know. On the note of like the customer side, right? I think a lot of times, like I even at Duo, it was always like, well, yeah, we want two-factor, but our CEO doesn't want to use it, right? So can you generate a bypass code or do something so he doesn't have to use it, or she doesn't have to use that control, right? At Blue Mirror, I've seen a similar activity sometimes, which is like, oh yeah, we want to be compliant, but like, yeah, I don't really care that we're using insecure things, right? Which is shocking sometimes when people don't care about security. But the reality is like there is a subset of customers that's actually or companies that is the case, unfortunately. And so I think in some ways, I think it's looking at like more or less how they prioritize those. But it's rather shocking sometimes when you get into like compliance and mandates versus actual security controls.
I mean, if you look at like two-factor auth or multi-factor auth or whatever, I've also seen people have that implemented and be compliant, which, I mean, whether you have compliance or not, two-factor is a good idea, right? But it was a very insecure implementation of two-factor auth. So not to go too deep into it, but basically, as opposed to, putting in your username and password and it like giving you a push notification or texting you a 6-digit PIN, it would call a number. And we had a lot of offsite offices that instead would just put their main office number. That way, anytime anyone would log in, it would all go to the same number, and all they had to do was hit pound to like okay the auth, which we actually had like third-party pen testers get through because they were able to capture credentials, and then everybody just always hit pound no matter what because they never knew who was authing.
Yep.
So sure, they were technically compliant.
On the yeah, it's interesting the sneaky things people try and do. On the poll, it looks like, you know, on the call we have broad spectrum of compliance, including 871. So PCI, HIPAA, 800, 171, CMMC, SOX, GDPR, and then there's a bunch of other as the list goes on and on. Which is interesting. I am kind of excited to launch the next poll because I think it ties back to what we've been talking about, and this is more or less a would you rather. So this one, would you rather meet compliance but knowingly have security gaps, have strong security controls but fail your I didn't complete the sentence, fail your compliance audit? Or I don't care about compliance or security. Why am I on this webinar again?
I'm so sad I can't vote.
Amanda, what would you vote? Because I have my answer.
I don't know why I'm on this webinar.
Mine is number 2. So honestly, I would much rather have a company that has proven security controls, that essentially gets a failed audit or a report that has exceptions to it, that gives you the opportunity. And this is again about the relationship with your auditor. It really reflects that you don't have the right auditor, or that it was a confrontational situation, or you're working with an auditing firm where it is not collaborative to get to appropriate recommendations and being able to communicate through your report what security controls you do have in place. And I've seen that happen. I've seen organizations who have security in place the way that they should for the level of their organization at that point in time. And they have exceptions, but the way that they manage this, the way that they manage their customer expectations, is they provide a management response in their report. They write up, what was missing, what was the exception, what are the controls. Essentially they say, we don't necessarily agree with this perspective, and they have the conversation with a customer. I think this is because this is about trust. You're sitting there with a customer and you explain, this is what happened, this is what's in place, here are all our cards, and allowing the customer to assess you as an organization and say, you do have these things, you are addressing these needs, maybe the auditor is off. So yeah, I'm definitely a number 2 person.
I guess it depends on if you can afford the fines or not. If they get to that point.
Right. And I think that's the question of a third-party compliance assessment, which one you're having done, versus something happened, like a breach. Right. And they're able to prove damages and harm. Different situation. We're assuming that if you've got security controls, we're not talking about there was an incident, whether it was a security incident or a breach incident, where there's damage or harm that was able to be calculated. To me, that's a completely different situation versus, hey, I failed my PCI assessment by this QSA, or my SOC 2 audit came back with some sort of exception on it.
Seems like most everyone agrees with you. Having strong security controls, but failing your audit. I agree with that as well. I think the other consideration is a lot of times, like, compliance frameworks can get outdated and old. Yes. And there's better compensating controls, right? Than what the actual compliance framework mandates. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of curious, how often is that?
How often does that happen? I think it happens quite a bit. I mean, Amanda, in your experience as well, because if we think about it, let's think about PCI right now. So PCI, we're waiting essentially for the next version of PCI, right? PCI 4.0, but it's gone through a big feedback loop. We've had this pandemic happen. So we've been sitting at PCI DSS 3.2.1 for quite some time. We know things like 853 and different NIST standards take a long time to kind of go through that revision process. And if it's really prescriptive, some of that gets outdated, and it's really challenging to be able to say, well, this still meets it. And again, that comes back to that, making sure you've got that right auditor relationship, and that you're being transparent in the relationship you have with your auditor to say, these are the assets we have. This is our security approach. These are the things that we've got, versus it being confrontational and them just representing one view versus representing their view and your view.
Other than like a confrontational auditor. No, I think it's funny. It's like, yeah, people can have their approach of an auditor a lot of times of like, it is confrontational, right? Like, hey, just can you pass me on this one?
I don't know. I feel bad for the auditors sometimes, because I feel a lot of times they just feel like they have to be confrontational because they can walk into an environment and they think everybody already hates them.
Yeah. Hey, so
and
maybe
it feels super bad for them sometimes.
Yeah, maybe that's something everyone can do when they have auditors, is like, hey, look, like, we'd rather just know and kind of take off that edge of confrontation up front.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's how do you set the tone within your organization, right? Versus being like, so-and-so is coming in to audit us. It's really painful. It's awful. People are there's not trust between you and the auditor, and your team and the auditor. So when they go into interviews, you're going to have folks, maybe you're going to have engineers who are going to withhold information, or, they're just not going to work in a collaborative way. And that's where I think it's really important that you have somebody within your IT or security organization who understands where your engineering team is coming from, understands your technical layout. Essentially, that person really needs to help represent the organization in the right way, and also work with the auditors to say, hey, the auditor has to ask these questions. It's okay to answer them, but also, like, don't go too far into a tangent. Like, the way that I've described it to engineers, it's like answering questions in a deposition. Answer the questions that are being asked of you. Don't lie, don't omit, but you don't have to go, all the way in left field unless we have that conversation of, okay, this is a mitigating control or alternating control or compensating control. So let's describe it technically and the implementation and essentially the problem that it's going to solve. Your compliance person or your auditor is really going to be focused on the what and the why of compliance, but you've got to have that good relationship internally, that you trust your engineers to be developing the how. How do we do this?
So develop a strong relationship with your auditor and your teams internally. Sounds like things particularly important there. So what are some of the examples of, when we're talking about the actual compliance frameworks, right, of different compliance controls and their intentions? Oh, sorry, and I'll stop sharing the poll. I think we talked about that question already. So then you can see our lovely faces.
Yeah. So Amanda, do you want to talk a little bit about logging, since that is your passion?
What I like to do. What was really the question, Patrick? You wanted to know?
Yeah. What are some different examples of common compliance controls and what their intentions are, right? So you have a list of all these different things, right? Like logging even is an example. It's like, well, what's the intention there?
Depends on the compliance framework.
Logging is boring.
Yeah, it really depends, because like there are some compliance frameworks that are very specific with what they want logged. Others are just like, this kind of activity should be logged. Others want you to review certain kinds of events every day. And some people take that to like extreme measures and have, 50 reports sent to them daily that they have to have somebody go through and read. It really just depends on which one that you have to comply with. I mean, there's definitely a correct way to handle a lot of those things. Some of the stuff that like computer account lockouts. To waste a security person's time going through and looking at every single computer lockout 99.9% of the time, it's just someone that forgot their password, or something that has expired, right? But if you look at it from a security perspective, you're looking for a number of lockouts over a short amount of time, or a lot of failed attempts over a short amount of time, or consistent issues, yeah, right, with account lockouts. So you can kind of tie the two together. But if you want to tell somebody that you're being compliant with it, you can just have the report sent to you, I guess. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can go about all of the requirements when it comes to logging.
So it's a lot of fun. I mean, yeah, I think there's always room for interpretation in the compliance guidelines, right?
Yep.
I think the other thing to keep in mind that generally speaking, you're going to see top level families across these different frameworks. You're going to see requirements related to access control, identity management. Those things are going to be there. It's an expectation. You're going to see things around configuration and change management. They want us to be able to see that both at the, how do you do this within your software development or production life cycles, as well as how does your customer or your purchaser manage the configuration of your product. So sometimes you're going to see it from two different perspectives. It's going to be about your organization. How do you do this? So to the left of the software development or product development lifecycle, all the way to your product and how does that enable it for your customer. Mm-hmm. You're going to see things around vulnerability management. Those are some expectations you're going to see across the board. Requirements you're going to see across the board, no matter the framework. It is, but it does come down to, well, what is it explicitly saying, right? We're seeing now regulation coming out around Internet of Things devices, right? As we talked earlier, not everything it has a very specific framework tied to it. HIPAA specifically to, medical information or protected health information. PCI is related to credit cards, but also folks who are service providers that provide things for processing of credit cards. And, SOC 2 is a set of organizational controls for your organization. But with Internet of Things, if you look at the California law that went into effect in January of this year, it's a really broad definition. And there's a law that was being pushed through Congress as of 2019 around, again, the definition of a connected device. And so you're going to see it more explicitly state pretty much anything that connects to the internet has to have these types of controls.
It's probably a good idea because, considering I drive around an autonomous vehicle pretty much nowadays. And you look at, I think last week, it's like, yeah, Tesla, literally someone found, and fortunately reported to Tesla, like a vulnerability that gave full fleet command and control. And so, yeah, I do think the IoT side of things, like it is becoming particularly important that we start driving the right security and compliance controls across that industry, it's not an industry, right? It's basically a use case. So yeah, it gets a little bit scary.
At the end of the day, what we're talking about here, whether you're a SaaS company, whether you provide financial services, whether you're a healthcare provider, or whether you're a federal contractor, whether you develop a health device or a medical device, right? Physical products, services. At the end of the day, what we're talking about here is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We want to ensure those things to protect both the systems as well as the data of our customers, whether it's a company or an end user. It's pretty simple. It's just, how do you do that?
Cool. Hey, this is a random question for everyone in the chat and for you too as well. Like, is there any across compliance frameworks that you've dealt with, right? Are there any compliance controls that you're just like, oh, really? We have to do this and there's absolutely no security value, or it actually like creates less security? Does anything come to mind? Putting you on the spot with that one. Any participants want to comment?
I have one. But I'm going to let Amanda go.
No, I can't. I'm thinking. You go first.
Password rotation.
Oh, it's such a
so
good one.
863, it's my right, 863.3. We have seen and yes, I'm quoting NIST documents because I know them. I am a NIST fangirl. Sorry. Actually, to be perfectly honest, I'm just a general compliance fan person. This is my PCI printout. This is my AICPA handbooks. Like, I literally have them everywhere. Oh,
I'm
hold
glad
on.
there's people like you.
There's ISO. I enjoy it, not because I like ticking boxes. I enjoy it because I like translating this and enabling business. But we've seen an update in 863. We know that at the end of the day, this does not, password rotation does not lead to usable security. When we do not have usable security, then people are going to get frustrated or other things are going to happen. Amanda, if you have opinions on it.
No, that's a really good one.
Oh, I think
was
yours
trying to
was
think.
password user lockout that you talked about earlier.
Well, yeah. I mean, having to pay attention to that is annoying.
Now, somebody's going to come to me and be like, oh, but Jamie, people can brute force and over time they're going to figure out what the password is. So you have to rotate it every 90 days. I hear you. But I also want to recognize around complexity and other aspects that were mentioned in there around using common password block lists and thinking about other forms of security implementations and controls around passwords that doesn't put that burden on the user for them to come up with a unique and secure password every time, every 90 days.
Yep.
We got a guest. Sorry. That's Jack. He wants to come hang out. Yeah, I agree. Someone did mention in the chat
organization charts in SOC 2.
Yes, I agree. And in some ways it's really strange because in organizations, I don't know how familiar folks are with, startup or what we've got to break down in here between startup and enterprise. You could be in a startup and wearing so many different hats, or you could be in a flat organization where there aren't these different titles. And so, or things will move throughout the course of the first couple of years. And even after that, to be perfectly honest. And the organizational charts aren't going to make that much of a difference to the report. Where I think organization matters is when we think about things like, how are we thinking about our threat modeling? How are we thinking about our risk assessment? The organizational charts are really more important internally so that oh, hey, so-and-so may have access to this information. Thusly, we need to ensure that X, Y, and Z are in place and that they have the appropriate security awareness training. But as a general, maintaining an organizational chart to be put in a SOC 2 report that goes externally, not quite as important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's another one I love in the chat, which is antivirus. That's a good one.
Yeah.
And I think the comment there is like, yeah, that there's not other ways to stop malicious software, right?
There are a couple. What is it? You probably know which compliance standard talks about like app locker and like application whitelisting.
Well, you can use application whitelisting.
I know. I thought one of them specifically called it out.
I'm trying to remember.
CSA star.
I was either a NIST. It was either NIST or PCI, I think.
Yeah, I've seen application whitelisting. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we can come back to it. It's a newer update because we were seeing that application whitelisting was being used as a compensating control or mitigating control to meet some of the older requirements of prescriptive standards. So we're seeing some of that change. Yeah.
Or maybe more important is just keep your host up to date.
That helps.
Oh, we're having a good time. On an organization side of things, what is the best way to kind of harvest the culture of compliance and security in helping organizations understand the importance of this and get behind it?
Get behind compliance. implementing compliance and why that's important?
Well, I think, yeah, generally speaking, it's like, hey, making security a part or a piece of culture. And I think compliance goes along with that as well. What does that look like?
Making it something that everybody should care about. First off, I've always had good luck with going to like C-levels and showing them the value of it when it comes to dollar amounts that could be saved. Because security is never a revenue generator. Right? Implementing is never revenue I mean, unless you're like actually security company, right? But also, if it's not implemented, what would those impacts be? So like doing a tabletop or just showing them like previous breaches that other people have had from mistakes that you may be also making internally. And then it kind of comes from the top down. If you have like security champions or other people that are kind of excited about it. Like I was really lucky, the couple places I worked, like our CEO was formerly a CISO. So he got it. Like he understood the technology and the terminology, and he knew why we had to do certain things. So it kind of just flowed from the top down, and it was easier. When you have people in higher levels that don't understand why it's important, starting there helps if you can get to that level. And just letting everybody know that it's not their job specifically to be like, yes, this is malware and this is what it's doing to my machine. But when you have to not just rely on, your endpoint antivirus or client or whatever you're using, you can rely a lot on your people. That's like one of the best parts of a good incident response is your front line are people. Letting the right people know that something weird's happening, that a fish has come in, that a pop-up has come up that hadn't before. Once you get to that level, it makes, everything go way smoother and faster.
I feel, a lot of what you're saying, Amanda, the people component is the most critical component and the one that gets neglected the most when we talk about compliance and security.
Mm.
Compliance, really focuses on technical controls and process. Like you hear that a lot. It's like tech and process, but that triad is and people. And if you're not considering controls or policies that think about this or affect people through like integrity, simplicity, and empathy, like if you don't have empathy for your people, if you're not creating simple policies, accessible policies, inclusive policies, then it's not going to work, and they're going to feel that tension. There's also, sometimes that contention and that opposition between, I've got to balance keeping the product online, right? If you're in an operational role, you're focusing on availability, and they don't have time to work on these security things that you're asking them to do. I think it's really important that you have to reframe this as part of the company culture and saying the things that we're requesting, we're not saying these are compliance requirements or like this, like I came down on high and be like, this is what you must do because security. We have to sit there and listen to what their pain points are and say, how can we work together to make this actually an operational improvement? And that's going to not only improve the pain that you're having from an availability perspective, but also improve it from a security perspective. Like the A in the CIA triad, availability, right? So it's not oppositional for an operational team, just being empathetic.
Good. Talk to your people, coordinate with them. I think too, there's some interesting tools. It's like collab tools, whether it's Teams or Slack, and providing channels, right, to interact is a great way to kind of pull that together, which is fun. Hey, there's something, and we can kind of go around a little bit more. If there's any questions, feel free to ask people on the call. It's been fun from an interaction perspective on the things that have been brought up. One of the things I was gonna just show and mention, like myself in working in the area of detection and response and SIM, right? It's been kind of interesting because a lot of a lot of people we talk to are like, well, why would I even deploy that? Like that's for people with compliance only. Which is really funny, but it's like, Okay. Yeah, you're right. It's on every single compliance framework that you should be doing logging and audit and detection and response. Um, one of the ways I essentially, or one of the things I've done, which has been really interesting and kind of shocking to a lot of people, is they didn't realize that, like, they don't really do centralized logging, audit, compliance, detection, alerting. And this is actually like a sheet I created of all the things, or many of the things that you should be doing. But in particular, I think generally speaking, you talk about a control like two-factor. People are generally pretty acknowledging, like, yeah, I should have that control in place. What's kind of interesting is we get into some of these deeper things. It's like, I think because it's hard to do, people perceive it as something they don't have to, or it's not important. And it's kind of ties back to, like, almost like the audit checkbox, right? Or the sheet of things that you should do from a requirements perspective. So I thought I'd just show that really quick, and curious to get your take on what I'm doing here.
Yeah, one of my biggest concerns is when I hear from an organization, well, this is hard, so we're not going to do it. Life is hard, right? I mean, we still carry on. Running a successful organization is hard. Bringing a product to market is hard, but we still do it. But we still want to offer this to our customers. Building and maintaining trust is hard, but we have to do it. And I think when we reframe that and say, okay, and ask that question, well, what about it is hard? And sometimes you get down to, well, it's a question of, I don't know how to do it. Or I'm afraid I didn't do it right. And kind of getting past some of that guilt and fear. Again, the people component. Figure out, why do you think it's hard? Let's work together to uncover that, get back to the problem that we're trying to solve, and then solve that problem. And it doesn't have to be perfect on day one. As long as we're consistent and iterative and growing our controls to address the threat and the risk, that's good. Now, I'm not saying it's good enough, like don't stall out of 4, but just keep swimming, right? We got to keep going.
Got to get that stuff in place. I think it's funny, earlier you mentioned top security control families, and you said access identity management. It's like, oh yeah, we did that at Duo. The other one was like logging and detection. It's like, yep, working on that one now. So my next startup is going to be in asset management.
Oh no.
I'm joking. It's kind of a joke.
I mean, it is something that a lot of people cannot do correctly.
Yeah. I think
management is super difficult.
Yeah, I don't know. This is more on asset discovery, like HT More and Rumble is cool stuff. I've been playing around with that a little bit, but yeah, I think the fact is a lot of these compliance requirements have been pretty complicated for a long time in order to actually get in place. And I think that is one thing as well from a compliance perspective, is like the technology is becoming easier from an adoption perspective. Which makes it more accessible to organizations, and that's probably one of the biggest interests to me from a security perspective, right? Is when you can actually give someone compliance-based level controls, even if they're a smaller organization.
Mm-hmm. I think to your point about it being, the technology is now more accessible. So I think the next stage that we're in now is making sure that the knowledge and the information about how you meet these controls is also, we want to make sure that is also accessible. Oftentimes that knowledge is essentially kept, there's gatekeeping that's done by auditing firms and advisory services. Yeah, I know they have to make money, but there should be, companies should feel comfortable talking about, this is how we met that control. This is what we're advocating for in public policy, or this is what we're advocating for at the PCI DSS, their council. I think having more of those conversations of, saying, here's what we did right, here's what we did wrong, this is how we thought about it, and the feedback that we received. It's not a competitive advantage to.
Uh-oh, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. Could you hear us? Uh-oh. What happened?
Can you hear me now?
Oh,
yes.
We can hear you now. Internet connection.
There we go.
Welcome to 2020.
Sorry, y'all. I don't know where I left off.
Are you on Charter or CenturyLink?
I am on Comcast. Anyway, don't know where I left off, but
That's right.
here we are.
Next topic.
It was good. It was good. You were passionate about it. That's all I remember. Cool. Well, we have a few more minutes. If anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Q&A. I'm just going to give a kind of 2-minute rundown on high-level overview of Blumira. We can then hop back to talk about compliances and then some of the things coming up, if that's cool, as well. So if there's anything else you two want to add as well, don't hesitate once I hop through this 1 to 2 minute overview. So yeah, we're just so everyone's aware on the Blumira side, our value proposition is helping get to detection and response in a matter of hours, eliminating noise, automating response, and/or providing playbooks on knowing what to do, even if you don't have the technical resources from a security perspective. And I should put on here, helping meet compliance. So kind of funny, could have had there. But how we work is essentially you have your existing product stacks, things like Active Directory, Azure AD, firewalls, servers, workstations, all that good stuff. Essentially automating the front end, and so that like ingestion, parsing, all these fun things that need to happen just work. And then surfacing threats, detecting them, and either automating action or providing a playbook and how to respond. So that's my under 2 minute high level overview, just so you're aware of what we do. If you weren't familiar with that. So I'll stop. And we can talk a little bit more if there are any questions. I'm just looking. I don't, see any in the comments maybe as I'm sharing my screen. But thank you first off for hopping on to talk about this today, Amanda and Jamie. Is there any other thoughts you have that you want to share in the last few minutes from a compliance perspective?
I just wanted to say, because I don't think we got to cover it much, that if you work towards a more secure environment, you're going to get at least 95% of the way to compliance. You just have to fill out more paperwork.
I mean, I agree. I mean, if you're working towards security and it's part of that cultural value, and that security is everybody's responsibility, not just your IT team or your security team, that it's every developer's responsibility, you are going to meet more of your compliance obligations. I think the other thing that's really important to think about, both in your policy development internally and how you think about controls, that both in the code and the policy that we have, we tend to inscribe our own values. So if you build a team that is representative of the users and the markets that you're trying to serve, that they're going to anticipate, solve problems, and do better threat modeling that those users and organizations face as well. So really thinking about how are we being diverse and not just when we say these things like, oh, how are we just, diversity and inclusion? We're really living it by saying we're hiring a team that has a background of knowledge that can really help inform our threat models and are representative of the people that we're trying to serve.
Sweet, I'm all game for that. I think a lot of times associated with that is people think, oh, I need this person that has 10 years of experience. And I think what I experienced, at least when being at Duo on the security side, is like, what's important is the person is capable and they can learn.
Also, to kind of add on to that point, if anyone's looking for a job, we're currently hiring.
Yeah, but Patrick, to your point, it's about analogous experience, right? What do you bring to the table that ultimately helps solve that problem? If you go back to what problem you're trying to solve, you don't solve the problem by having, 4 years in a computer science degree. That doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
But the knowledge that you have and the ability to apply it to a situation, that's what makes a difference. You know, if you have somebody who's a background, they are former military, they're probably going to have the potential to pick up organizational incident response very quickly. So you don't underestimate your experience and its applicability to InfoSec.
Cool. I think it's great. I guess we're hiring. That's funny. To wrap it up, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us, Jamie and Amanda. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks everybody for joining on the webinar from a viewing perspective and on YouTube Live. And next week, we will be, can you see my, yeah, there we go.
There you go.
We'll be talking about lateral movement and honeypots with Haroon from Thinks Canary and Matt Warner, our CTO at Blue Mira. So that should be fun at 1 p.m. So thanks so much. And it's great if anybody wants to join us next week as we continue the series. Jamie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, if anybody wants to hear more about the topics that I covered today or drill down into any of the individual frameworks or NIST special publications, more than happy to do so. Reach out to Patrick, you can find me on the internet. If you're interested in how maturing your information security program, it's like running an ultramarathon, or how Alexander Hamilton's Reynolds pamphlet is an example of how not to respond to an incident, by all means, please let me know. Happy to talk to you about that too.
What was that? Alexander Hamilton's what response?
Reynolds pamphlet. So the way that Alexander Hamilton responded to an issue was a bad example of incident response and crisis communication.
All right. All the way from 1650. I don't know what year it was. Oh, that sounds like
not
fun.
that far back.
No? When was Alexander Hamilton?
I feel like I may know this story. There was a podcast that I listened about him recently.
Yeah. So, yep,
Cool.
During the Revolutionary War, Patrick.
Mhm.
So,
I don't know. 1776. That's what it is. All right, we're good. Right? Is that right? Not 16.
Not 16.
Isn't it on here? Yeah, there we go.
There's a reason I'm not good at.
It's on my shirt.
I was right. I'm not good at history. I was just a few hundred years old. So, hey, thanks. It's great connecting again. Appreciate you hopping on and talking.
yeah,
so much.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you all for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you guys.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Oh, wait, there's
Bye.
more messages. Oh, no, nothing. Later.